Justice Secretary has announced that transgender prisoners with male genitalia should not be sent to women's jails. In a parliamentary statement, Brandon Lewis said his reforms would also affect trans women convicted of a sex offence.
They don't want men in their prisons. They don't like it. They feel threatened. In many cases, the men are threatening. Rapes have been reported in many places across the U.S. and New Jersey.
The screams echo through the concrete hallway. One woman was banging on the door, clutching a torn bedsheet. Another inmate stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Just hours earlier, a new inmate, broad-shouldered, 6 feet 2 inches tall, deep voice, had been transferred into their unit. He identified as a woman, but the tattoos, the Adam's apple, the unmistakable aura of testosterone, none of that had changed. By nightfall, 2 women had already requested protective custody. One refused to shower, another didn't eat for days. But this wasn't an isolated incident. It's happening across the country. And what led to this controversial shift in the prison system? To answer that, we have to look at how one law, one ideology, and one loophole collided. Section 1, the policy shift that started it all. In 2021, California passed Senate Bill 132, the Gender Health and Safety Act, allowed incarcerated individuals to be housed according to their gender identity, not their biological sex. Within the first few months, over 300 biological males housed in men's prisons applied to transfer to female facilities. The reasoning? To reduce victimization, prevent harassment, and align with gender-affirming practices. But what lawmakers didn't anticipate was how many of these transfers had histories of violent crime, including against women. One prisoner who had once been convicted of raping his girlfriend was now sharing a cell with a woman who had been a survivor of abuse. This led to something no one was prepared for: pregnancies. And what happened after the pregnancy started? That opened an entirely new can of worms. Section 2, pregnancies behind bars. What really happened? In early 2022, reports surfaced from the Central California Women's Facility that 2 inmates were pregnant, despite no male staff or visitors ever being alone with them. The prison administration confirmed both pregnancies were the result of consensual relationships between female inmates and transgender women, biological men who had been transferred under Senate Bill 132. Suddenly, prison officials were distributing condoms and Plan B pills, but it raised a question no one wanted to answer. If these were truly women, why were these precautions necessary? And more importantly, what about the women who never consented to the presence of male anatomy in their most vulnerable spaces? But the question of consent goes deeper, because some women weren't engaging voluntarily at all. Section 3, when identity becomes a weapon. Some transferred inmates had a long rap sheet, not just of violence, but of manipulation. One inmate, now going by the name Lisa, had over 30 misconduct violations before the transfer, including physical intimidation of smaller cellmates. Once placed in a women's prison, Lisa began asserting dominance in disturbing ways. Several women claimed they were coerced into relationships. Others simply gave in just to avoid confrontation. Guards were reluctant to intervene, fearing accusations of transphobia. One former corrections officer anonymously admitted, "We weren't allowed to question it. You misgender them, you could lose your job, even if you see a woman terrified to sleep in her own bed." This created an environment of fear, not just among inmates, but among staff. But how did this policy get implemented so fast without more scrutiny? For that, we have to dive into the ideological engine behind it. Section 4, The rise of self-ID laws in America. Self-ID laws allow individuals to declare their gender identity without any physical transition, surgery, or hormone therapy. While the intention behind these laws was to protect transgender people from discrimination, the unintended consequences, particularly in closed environments like prisons, have become undeniable. The logic was simple. If gender is self-identified, then prisons must follow suit. But many experts warned about the risks of applying this to sex-segregated spaces. One former prison psychologist explained, "In every environment, you'll have people looking for an angle, especially in prison. If you give someone a way to game the system, someone will use it." And that's exactly what started happening. But there was one case that shook the entire system. Section 5, the New Jersey prison that shut down transfers. The biological father was a transgender inmate who had been convicted of multiple assaults. The media exploded. Public backlash forced the state to pause future transfers. Quietly, some of the transgender inmates were moved back to male facilities without. One of the pregnant inmates gave birth behind bars, and the child was sent into foster care. Another female inmate, a survivor of sexual trauma, filed a lawsuit claiming that being housed near biological men had re-traumatized her daily. And here's where things took an even darker turn. Section 6, mental health fallout inside the walls. For many women, prison is already a place of trauma. Over 60% of incarcerated women have experienced physical or sexual abuse before entering prison. Now imagine sharing a shower, a bathroom, or a small locked cell with someone who has male anatomy, a deep voice, and a history of violence. Psychologists began seeing spikes in anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms. One inmate described it like this: "Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the room where it first happened. But now, there was no escape. This time, my abuser was in the next bunk." Section 7, media blackout and political silence. Many of these incidents went unreported or were buried in euphemistic language. Words like individuals assigned male at birth replaced biological men. Terms like pregnant people substituted female inmates. News outlets feared backlash. Politicians avoided the topic altogether. Why? Because it was politically radioactive. Advocating for female inmates meant being accused of being anti-trans. Advocating for trans rights meant ignoring the safety of women. Even women's rights organizations found themselves divided. Section 8, when the inmates themselves started speaking out. In 2023, a group of incarcerated women filed a class action lawsuit against the California Department of Corrections. They claimed that being housed with biological males violated their 8th Amendment rights, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. The suit included testimony of harassment, threats, and even physical assault. One plaintiff wrote, "I don't hate anyone, but I shouldn't have to trade my safety for someone else's identity." Slowly, more women began to write letters, give anonymous interviews, and speak through their advocates on the outside. They weren't asking for punishment, they were asking for separation. They weren't calling for cruelty, they were asking for clarity. And now, the system is being forced to reckon with a question no one wants to answer. How do we protect the rights of transgender individuals without sacrificing the safety and dignity of women? That's the question at the heart of this debate, and it's not going away. As prisons try to adapt, lawsuits grow, and public awareness increases, one thing is clear: the lines we've drawn between gender and sex may be blurred on the outside, but inside prison walls, the consequences of that confusion are being felt every single day. And while ideology may shape policy, it's the people who live with those policies who bear the cost. No politics, no shouting, just the quiet truth echoing behind locked steel doors.